And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another recap of my weekend from the Czech Extraliga, where I managed to score a performance crossing 2600. So I'm pretty happy with my performance. And as you can see here, the first game, which I played on Saturday, I played against none other than Radoslaw Wojtaszek, who is a very famous Polish grandmaster, not only for his own tremendous successes. He used to be he was always part of the 2700 club. Now recently he dropped a little bit below that, but he's still an absolute top player. And on top of that, he's also, he was the second for Gukesh at the World Championship match. He was one of the seconds there. So yeah, pretty strong player overall. And I have played him once already before, actually. But it's always pretty cool to play against such a strong player. So let's look at how the game went. He started by going c4, I went e6, knight c3, d5, d4, knight f6, and here I allowed him to go into this Karlsbad with cd5, ed5, bishop g5 and c6, which I briefly prepared before the game. Of course, important to point out, if white starts with c4, of course, now with this move order, he's avoiding the Nimzo Indian, which arises after this move order. But in return, I do get some extra options, like I could go for c5, I could also go for e5. But in general, I felt like I should be pretty happy to play this Karlsbad structure against him, because I haven't had, I think, any games at all here, and I did have some preparation, which I haven't used yet. So he went bishop g5, c6, and now e3, and here I went for this solid line with bishop f5, which used to have kind of a sad reputation due to the main line queen f3. When after bishop g6, this sort of endgame always had the reputation of just being very sad for black, and probably it still does have that reputation, but in my eyes it's actually not so bad. And I had one game against Erwin Lamy from the white side, where even I had to be careful in some cases. So knight f3 is how the main line goes, and I think Erwin played bishop b4 immediately against me, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe he started with knight d7, and there was, wait, hang on, I think it was, let me think, was it a5 maybe? I do remember something like this is what he played, and in general, it was not so easy because he just intended to push the pawn to a4, and sometimes even bishop b4 was an idea. In the game, I think I had this, I think, if I'm not mistaken, b5, and I think I went for something like this, but it turns out black is actually completely fine here. I think that was the game, at least one of the games. Yeah. That is my game against Erwin Lamy. So quite similar, and actually that is totally fine for black. So this line with a5 has seen quite some popularity recently. But also black has some other options here as well. So my opponent didn't want to go for this endgame, and he went for bishop d3, which after takes, now black probably has a pretty comfortable version of the Karlsbad overall, because he did manage to exchange this usually passive bishop on c8, but still the position remains fairly playable, and I did give him some chances later on. And I immediately went knight d7, which is maybe not the most accurate way. Actually, what I had prepared, but not for that game, just before that, was this idea with knight a6, which I think is a bit better than the knight d7, because now the point is I'm simply going with my knight to e6, and now like this I don't waste a move on rook e8, because if I go to d7 first, then I always have to waste this move rook e8, and then to go knight f8, knight e6. So I think knight e6 is a better version simply, and after f3 and knight c7, knight comes to e6, and in general black has the idea of going knight h5 pretty often here. For example, even after bishop f2, I think knight h5 was my analysis, when I'm just kind of prophylactically playing against e4, when I do have some counterplay with knight f4 here. Also, one nice trick was that after e4, I can take and go knight c5, and there is this idea here, take on e4, and now he cannot take here because I can take on h4, and if he takes on e7, I'm a pawn up. He will probably hold a draw with knight g3, but yeah. So this is the whole point here. I think that this is more accurate than what I played. I played knight b7, and after short castle, I went short castle. Still, knight f8 would have been quite a serious option as well. Again, with the same idea to reach the same position as before, but now I do give him some extra options like b4, which wouldn't be there if I would have taken the route through knight a6, knight c7. So I went castle f3 and now rook e8, and after rook a1 I went knight f8. Maybe not the best setup. Again, b5 is a very typical way of handling the position, but during the game I wasn't sure about the position after knight g3. I calculated b4, knight a4, and after queen a5, b3 I kind of stopped because I didn't really like my position. e4 is kind of in the air, always knight f5 as well, and it turns out black is actually totally fine if I go c5 and take everything. Now the big point is he cannot take on f6 because I have rook takes e3. And if he goes knight f5, queen b6, apparently this is fine for black objectively, but still it looks, it just looks a little bit worse for me practically. Looks a little bit unpleasant for black still. So I went rook a1, knight f8, and here he went bishop h4. Computer points out that bishop f6 is even stronger, and after takes now to go e4. Why not e4 right away? I thought, at least in the game, that I have this trick again here, that I have knight takes e4 and I'm winning a pawn. So that's what a computer wants to do this, and I intended to take and go knight g6, and at first I thought it looks quite horrible. In general, these positions look pretty bad for black, but I analyzed something quite similar some time ago, and it turns out that black is actually still quite solid, because I always do have some counterplay on white center, and I don't really have that many weaknesses yet. So turns out this is actually not so bad. I analyzed one line here, e5, bishop e7, queen c4, simply rook f8. And the only thing black needs to avoid is this knight coming to f5. So after knight g3, knight h4 is quite important. And black will follow up with queen d7 and rook d8. Even in some cases, some queen g4 ideas are there as well, just to get some counterplay. And actually, this is nothing that special for white. So he played bishop h4, quite understandable. Just to go back to f2, I went with my knight to g6 here. And here I went for this move rook c8, which does look quite strange, but I saw similar ideas in other positions. And my point in general with this rook c8 move was that whenever he goes e4, I intended to take here and then go c5. So now my pawn is protected on c5, but it turns out that this plan is actually not that great, because white can in most cases just let black take on e4, which I think both of us completely underestimated. I thought in general after c5 he has to do something concrete, like either push d5 or e5, but both of them don't work. If e5 I just have knight g4. And if d5 I simply get access to this nice e5 square, and I have perfect control along these dark squares. So I thought this is just fine for me, but it turns out if he makes a move like king h1, just to have the option of knight g4, bishop g1 later on, it turns out that black is actually under some pressure here. C takes d4, bishop takes d4, queen a5, knight g3, for example, could become quite unpleasant, because the knight is always coming to f5. That's kind of the key point here. Still, I'm not lost yet. I can play something like queen a5 immediately. It's a bit more flexible, and the game goes on, but already here e4 would have been a very critical move. Also, by the way, knight g4 might be a safer option for black than to go c5, just to point that out. I do have some ideas like bishop g5 always to try to make some trouble here on the e3 square. So that's also an option. But he went knight g3, I went bishop f8. And here he went h3 again. If e4, again my idea was to go for this. Also here again white has some options, so this is definitely one of the critical options. But he went for h3 just to prepare e4 without allowing knight g4 later on after d takes e4, f takes e4. And here I made this move a6, which is probably quite a big mistake, because again I completely underestimated this idea with e4. Thankfully he didn't go for that. Instead of a6, I should just clarify the situation in the center with c5, and after takes, if he takes on d5, then it's probably just a draw, because I get to take on e3, and otherwise the pawn on e3 is quite weak, so it will be something quite similar to what happened in the game later on. So I went a6, which again looks quite strange. My idea was to prepare b5 and only then to go c5. But again, I totally underestimated e4, and now probably was his biggest chance to do so. After takes, c5 was my idea, but after knight f5, it turns out I'm in quite big trouble, because whenever I take here, bishop takes d4, and there are just too many threats here on the king side, and I'm in a lot of danger here. But he went king h1 and b5, and now I actually prepared to go c5. Again, e4 probably was his last chance now to go for this, even though now I already achieved something with this extra move b5. So probably his biggest chance was to go e4 here. He went knight c2 instead, and now finally I push c5, take on c5. Otherwise I get the option to gain space on the queen side with c4. So he took, went b3, queen b6, knight f5, and knight e7. I think a nice move, just trying to exchange one of those knights, just to clarify the situation, just to trade some pieces to make my defensive task a bit easier. Knight ft4, knight c6. He went again back with the knight. Knight c2. I went knight b4, which seemed quite logical to me, just to exchange these knights after all. Even though I don't get a great version out of this, still felt like a very solid continuation. Also, computer says something like h6 is totally fine. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify here. So he took and went knight f4. By the way, e4 does look like a nice discovery, but I can just take here, and if he takes on b6, I take on d3, and probably I'm even winning here, because the knight on e2 is hanging not one, but two times. So he went knight f4, and here was kind of a move that doesn't look special at all, but felt like a very nice move to me during the game, which I only found after quite a long thought, which is the move h6. Looks pretty harmless, but actually in this position I still felt like I'm under some pressure, because the pawn on d5 is quite weak, and white always has some ideas sometimes with bishop h4. For example, queen a5 was one idea which I had previously, but then bishop h4 is actually quite unpleasant, because now pawn on e3 is not even attacked anymore. So that was also my idea with h6, that I'm totally cutting out any bishop h4 options, because I will always have g5 forking the bishop and the knight on f4. So yeah, he could try some moves here, but he decided to take on d5, and yeah, here I have numerous ways to go for the draw. I went bishop c5. Also rook c2 gives me adequate compensation after something like a4. I can just take and go a5, and my pieces are just so active that I don't have anything to worry about here. So I went bishop c5 instead, and here we just went for this these simplifications. He pinned me, but I can protect the rook on e3, rook e8, rook d1, and I went g6. Many ways lead to the draw here. I took, he took, and after rook e1 takes, I offer the draw, and he accepted. So overall, I'm pretty happy with this game. I could have done things better in the opening if I would have remembered this idea with knight a6. I think that's a much better option for me. Other than that, I thought during the game that this whole plan with rook c8 and a6 was quite interesting, just to always meet e4 with take and c5, but it turns out that it's actually not working so well here. So I definitely learned something. I shouldn't go for this plan here. If I don't find this knight a6, knight c7, I should at least go for b5 here. That's kind of the things I learned from this game. So yeah, let's have a look at the second game, which was played on Sunday. So in the second game of this weekend of the Czech Extraliga, I played against the strong Greek grandmaster Pavlidis Antonios with a current rating of 2573, and I had the white pieces in the game. I started off by going e4, which I haven't done in quite some time actually. I mainly played some closed openings, d4, knight f3, c4 recently, but I felt like, yeah, I will start off the year. This was actually my first white game this year, so I thought I would start it off a little bit more aggressive by going e4. And he went e5, knight f3, knight c6, and yeah, we have the very, very classical Ruy Lopez, and he went for the marshal with short castle. So here I went for my main move, which I already have quite some games here, with a4. Of course, the main line is c3, and after d5, this is the very, very well-known Marshall Gambit, which yeah is probably one of the most well-analyzed openings out there. And of course, white has absolutely no advantage here at all. So a4 kind of aims to keep the game a bit more complex and less forcing, and black has a number of options here. My opponent played the little bit more rare move, rook b8, which was popularized by Magnus Carlsen in his match against Jan Nepomniachtchi from the year 2021, I think. Their World Championship match, where Magnus played this, I think, 2 times against Nepo. The other moves, of course, the main move is b4, and the other move is bishop e7. So also huge theoretical lines, both of them. But my opponent went rook b8, which kind of aims to keep the game even less forcing. Like after b4, d4, there are some more forcing lines. Also bishop b7 often can become very sharp with this typical knight maneuver for white to the king side, where white often gets some attack there. So we went rook b8. I took on b5. And here I went for d3, which is actually a little bit of an inaccurate move. And I even knew that during the game, but for some reason I played it too fast. So the better options for white are to either go c3 or to go h3. I think h3 is the best practical move, basically, because if you go c3, it does allow black to go d5, and even though white has a little bit of a better version compared to the Marshall, because the a file is opened and the rook is a bit passive on b8, it's probably still very much okay for black. Like he still has the typical Marshall compensation here. So I think that h3 is a bit more accurate because now after d6, white can go c3 and try to go d4 in one go, which basically forces black to immediately go b4. And this was also one of the games between Nepo and Magnus, where Nepo definitely had some advantage. Like this was their game, and position was a little bit unpleasant for Magnus. I think there was one quite a big chance for Nepo to get a nice advantage. Of course, the position is still very close to equal, but I think this is one of the better tries against this line. Another point why h3 is more accurate, because I started with d3. Now that gives black the option to technically go bishop c5. Kind of to lose this tempo, but just to get the bishop out basically to a more active square. My opponent anyway went d6, which I was happy to see because I was a little bit afraid of bishop c5, honestly. But he went d6, and now I could anyway go h3, and we would be back in the other line. So it would just be more accurate to start with h3, because now if he goes bishop c5, I go c3 and d4 in one go, and yeah, this is just good for white. So yeah, d6, and here now I went c3. I wanted this sort of position, but without allowing d5 basically. But yeah, I think either I should try h3 and then c3, or h3 and then d3, which I could also achieve from my game's move order. Here after h3, if I don't go c3, black usually does kind of the same as happened in the game. He goes h6 just to prepare rook e8, then bishop f8, and then bishop e6. This is kind of the whole idea of it all. And white does have some options, like knight bd2 was played with the idea of knight f1, knight g3. Bishop d2 was played, knight c3 was played. Knight c3 during the game, it bothered me knight before this move, because white kind of wants to get knight d5, but now I get to play knight b4, and after knight e2, c5. And yeah, I wasn't quite sure about this position overall. Of course, I knew it was playable, something like bishop d2, knight c6, but I wasn't that familiar with this structure in general, and I thought that he was more experienced here. So yeah, I didn't really want to go here. So instead I went c3, he went h6, knight bd2, rook e8, knight f1, and here he went bishop f8, and I made this very careless move h3, which of course I'm not worse here, but it just gives away all the pressure I potentially have. I should start with knight g3. The point is, now if he goes bishop e6, which he also did in the game, I can take and then go d4 immediately. Why couldn't I do that in the game? Because after h3 I went bishop e6, and now I cannot take because after d4, of course, the pawn on e4 is hanging, and I thought that here I don't have anything because of queen e8, and he's protecting both of the knights. That's kind of the main point. So yeah, knight g3 would have been much more accurate. He doesn't even have to go bishop e6. He can also go for something like this, which is also okay for black. But he did tell me that he was planning to go here. And at least I have somewhat of a better version. Even here after rook e8, there's not much happening at all in this position. But after h3, bishop e6, he just completely equalized on the spot, basically. I went knight g3, and here he took on b3, which I was happy to see. d5 was the move I was not afraid of, but I thought it's just the best for him. And I thought now it's just a big fight, like 3 results are possible. And I was intending to go bishop e3 here, and then probably something like queen c2 next. He will go queen d7, and it's just a complex game here. But I thought d5 is the better move. But also what he played, bishop b3, queen takes b3, and b4 is just objectively absolutely nothing. But at least here I thought I'm super safe. I can never really lose. And black is still the one that is a little bit more passive, but the position is just completely balanced in general. Instead of b4, he could have also went d5, which is also totally fine for black. He went b4, queen c4, I took back, because if I take here, he can take on b2 and won a pawn. After takes, I mean. So I took back, queen d7, and after rook a6, knight e7, I went for this repetition here, because I simply thought there's nothing left in the position, basically. In general, I briefly thought about going something like bishop d2 or bishop e3 here, but I thought that his plan in general is to go rook b7 and then rook b8, and then he also has some counterplay along the b file, potentially. So yeah, I was fairly happy with the draw against a strong player. A little bit upset that I couldn't get anything more out of the opening, but yeah. So 2 draws in this weekend against 2 very strong opponents. I'm fairly happy. I won 3 whole rating points, so that's also not bad. By the way, I'm gonna play another game on Wednesday in the Betriebsliga. It's like a small local league in Vienna, which is always interesting to play there. But yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed this recap of the weekend. I think the games have been quite interesting in general, even though they haven't been such long games. I think there were still many interesting things to discuss. So if you did enjoy the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a lot. And hope to see you guys in the following videos. So take care, everyone.